Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 713, and today is November 18th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a few huge stories that we really need to talk about in today's show. This will be an episode that you want to share. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute and reposted on the blog at antiwar.com. The video version goes up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you're watching, and if it's on YouTube, hit that notification bell. That way they let you know when a new episode of the show drops. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, where I post every episode of this show, all the articles that I write, and the newsletters that I put out. All right, first up on today's show is an article that I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday. Putin tells German leader that Ukraine peace deal is possible. So Russian President Vladimir Putin held a phone call with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and offered to end the war in Ukraine. The Russian leader offered a similar deal to the one proposed by Moscow in June. On Friday, Scholz spoke with Putin for the first time in nearly 2 years. According to the Kremlin, the Russian president noted that the Russian side has never refused and remains open to the resumption of negotiations that were interrupted by the Kiev regime, adding that Russia's proposals are well known and outlined, in particular, a June speech at the Russian Foreign Ministry. In that speech, Putin said that if Ukrainian forces withdrew from all Russian annexed territory, adopted a position of neutrality between NATO and Russia, and agreed to the denazification and demilitarization of the country, along with the lifting of Western sanctions on Moscow, then Russia would bring the war to an end. Now, those are some pretty steep demands, but as I've talked about a lot on this show, that Ukraine, but more importantly, Ukraine's Western backers are not without bargaining chips to help the Ukrainians get a better deal. And so, there may be some level of denazification and demilitarization that Russia is fully unwilling to compromise on, but there may be some levels of, Ukrainian hardliners that they will allow to remain in the government, some amount of American-made weapons or domestically produced Ukrainian weapons that will probably be just manufacturing Western-style weapons inside Ukraine that Russia would allow if, say, the U.S. would agree to move the Aegis Ashore missile systems from Poland and Romania, as the Kremlin views those as strategic threats to Moscow, as those systems are capable of firing nuclear-capable cruise missiles. And so those are a huge deal for Russia. So taking that off the table, further NATO expansion off the table, agreeing not to hold war games right on the Russian border. These are all things that the Washington could agree to that would maybe help Ukraine have a better place at the negotiating table. Maybe Russia agrees that they don't take all of Zaporizhia or Kherson or the Donbass areas that they haven't conquered, and they allow the war and the new borders of Russia to be redrawn around the current front lines rather than what they have annexed, which is additional territory from there. Again, we just had to be willing to compromise, and I think Russia may be willing to as well. Certainly, when I think the Russians talk about we're willing to enter into diplomacy, they do mean that there's going to be negotiations, not that this is a take it or leave it offer. So Scholz's spokesman said the German and Russian leaders agreed to remain in contact. The official added that Scholz condemned the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and called on President Putin to end and withdraw his troops. He also told Putin that Berlin maintains steadfast determination to support Ukraine for as long as necessary. Now, it's really unfortunate that he would make this call and restate these comments. Now, maybe he didn't actually on his call with Putin, and these are just things that the German government put out afterwards because they think it sounds good and it's what people need to hear. Of course, Russia knows by the billions of dollars that you've given to Ukraine that Germany and the entire West, the entire NATO alliance, the G7, all condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they are demanding that Putin ends withdraw his troops. That's been stated from the beginning. So, saying that if he said that to Putin was probably a mistake. And then the second part, that Berlin maintains steadfast determination to support Ukraine for as long as necessary, is just a lie. So when Zelensky took the Ukrainians to war and decided not to go through with the negotiations that were happening in March of April of 2022, there was a promise made to Zelensky that the West would give Ukraine whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And it's clear that that hasn't happened. Now, I think it hasn't happened for a good reason. And at the time when the Western leaders made that promise, I say, you can't possibly make that promise because it'll lead to a nuclear war with Russia. And we've essentially seen that where the West is unwilling to cross red lines, which it thinks may invoke a direct Russia-NATO war, and for good reason. However, this repeated propaganda that we're going to support Ukraine as much as it takes for as long as it takes is selling Ukrainians a major, major lie, right? That if the Ukrainians believe they're going to get whatever is necessary and that never comes, then they're going to end up in a worse position than they would have been. Well, they certainly already are now than had they just negotiated with Russia in 2022, but certainly passing up on the 2024 offer from Russia could mean that Ukraine loses even more territory and has to agree to more concessions, becomes even more of a rump state than it otherwise would have been if they continued to fight this war on the Western province that they're going to get all the weapons that they need when that promise obviously isn't going to be fulfilled. So throughout the Joe Biden administration, the West has refused to talk to Moscow about core national security issues. Their refusal to negotiate throughout 2021 led Putin to invade Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. After the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, a deal was nearly reached, but Kiev has been pushed away from negotiations by its Western backers. And at the time, Boris Johnson even went to Ukraine and delivered the message, even if you're ready to negotiate and sign a deal with Putin, we are not. And so the Ukrainians were essentially told by the West that they can't take a diplomatic settlement to this war in the first and opening months of it. So after over 2.5 years of war, Kiev is struggling to find the manpower to continue to fight while losing territory to the Russian military. Though NATO countries pledged to give Ukraine everything it needed to win the war, Washington has refused to provide Ukraine with advanced weapons and long-range missiles. Kiev says it needs to be able to achieve victory. Now, when I'm talking about the long-range missiles, I'm talking about the JASSMs. However, Ukraine got a massive gift from the Americans over this weekend. Report: Biden allows Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range U.S. missiles. This one from November 17th, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. The New York Times reported on Sunday that President Biden has authorized Ukraine's use of long-range U.S.-provided missiles in strikes on Russian territory, an escalation Moscow has made clear risks nuclear war. U.S. officials told the paper that Ukraine can now use the Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, which have a range of up to 190 miles, to strike Russian territory. The ATACMS are fired by U.S.-made multiple launch rocket systems known as HIMARS. Ukraine can only fire the HIMARS with coordinates provided or confirmed by the U.S. and its allies, meaning the U.S. will now directly support strikes deep inside Russian territory. The U.S. officials say that ATACMS will likely initially be used to hit Russian troops fighting against Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk Oblast. Ukraine and the U.S. have said that North Korean troops are deployed to Kursk. The U.S. has said that North Korean troops are engaged in combat, but that hasn't been confirmed by Moscow. Earlier this year, President Biden gave Ukraine the green light to strike Russian border regions with U.S.-provided weapons, including the shorter rockets fired by the HIMARS. A few months later, Ukraine launched its invasion at Kursk, and Ukrainian officials began pushing hard for the U.S. to support longer-range strikes inside Russia. Now, I think maybe what tipped the scales and made Biden sign off on this is the potentially just propaganda that North Korean soldiers are fighting in Ukraine. For weeks, the Ukrainians have been saying, well, if the Russians are using North Koreans to fight not in Ukraine, inside Russian territory, inside Kursk, then you have to give us permission to use these long-range weapons. That never really seemed like, why would one correlate with the other? But that was the propaganda push, and it now seems to have worked, kind of surprisingly. So in response to those calls and condemnation from Western officials supporting the idea, Russian President Vladimir Putin said if NATO supported long-range strikes inside Russia, it would put the military alliance at war with Russia. Putin then ordered changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine that lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. Under the new doctrine, an attack on Russia by a non-nuclear armed state that was supported by a nuclear power will be considered a joint attack. The Kremlin said that the changes to the nuclear doctrine were meant as a message to the West. The spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "This is a message that warns these countries of the consequences should they participate in an attack on our country by various means, not necessarily nuclear." The U.S. is prepared. The U.S. appeared to bat down on supporting long-range strikes in Russia, but now the Biden administration is looking to escalate the proxy war as much as possible for its last few months in power. President-elect Donald Trump campaigned on ending the proxy war, and the Biden administration and officials in Ukraine fear he will do just that. However, some of Trump's cabinet picks favor escalation in Ukraine, including his national security advisor, Representative Mike Waltz. So in a recent interview with NPR, Waltz asked how Trump could end the war in Ukraine, and he suggested an escalation of sanctions and support for long-range strikes in Russia. So this is Waltz's quote, "First and foremost, you would enforce the actual energy sanctions on Ukraine. Russia is essentially a gas station with nukes. Putin is selling more oil and gas now than he did pre-war through China and Russia. And if you couple that with unleashing our energy, lifting our LGN ban, and this economy, and his war machine will dry up very quickly." So I think that will get Putin to the table. We will have leverage, like we're taking the handcuffs off the long-range weapons provided to Ukraine as well. And then, of course, I think we have plenty of leverage with Zelensky to get them to the table. Now, I'm not so sure that last part's the case, but with the rest of it, this is going to provoke a nuclear war if Trump moves through with this. It's also absolutely absurd that Biden is taking this step as a lame duck president when the American people just went to the polls and voted for a candidate that had pledged to end this war. Simply absurd. Okay, so if we are able to skirt the nuclear war, this may be of issue one day. Pentagon still unable to pass audit. So I wrote this one for the Institute on November 17th. The Department of Defense's inability to track its finances continues as the Pentagon failed its 7th audit on Friday. The DoD has a massive budget of $820 billion and spent over $170 million on the failed audit. Since 2018, Congress has mandated the Pentagon undergo an audit each year, which the DoD, with the goal of the DoD finally passing the financial report by 2028. So far, the Department of Defense has been unable to pass the audit, while department officials say they're making progress. Still, fewer than a third of the Pentagon's agencies have actually passed the audit. So Michael McCord, the Pentagon's Undersecretary of Defense and Chief Financial Officer, said, "This result was not a surprise, and I know that on the surface it doesn't sound like we're making progress. However, that is not the case. I believe the department has turned a corner in its understanding of the challenges and, more importantly, in addressing those challenges." Now, if you read the audit, all the entire thing, hundreds of pages of this, government gobbledygook that says, oh, there's challenges and we're, have momentum and we're, adopting principles to face those challenges, but they never really lay out what those challenges are, what principles they're adopting, or how anything is going to get better. In fact, if you look at this year compared to last year, it doesn't seem like there was any real progress made. Last year, for the first time, the Marines became the first branch of the military to actually pass their audit, and the Air Force, Army, etc. haven't gotten any closer to making that happen. And so this is all just absolute BS that is put out by our government to make us think it's not a big deal that we have an $800 billion a year agency with $4 trillion in assets and $4 trillion in liabilities that has no accounting for it whatsoever. So the auditors spent 1,700 auditors spent $178 million reviewing 28 Pentagon agencies. 9 agencies passed, 15 received disclaimers, and 3 options remain pending. The auditors believe one agency gave misstatements, preventing a final decision from being reached. So this is just flushing our hard-earned money all down the toilet of the military industrial complex, so it ends up in the hands of some rich weapons maker or executive, some member of the military industrial complex. All right, let's get going here on stories about the Middle East. More than 100 Palestinians in Gaza killed by Israeli forces in one day. So Israeli forces killed at least 111 Palestinians in Gaza on Sunday, Al Jazeera reported, citing medical sources, as Israeli strikes continue to pound targets across the Strip. The majority of those killed were killed in a residential building in northern Gaza that was sheltering forcibly displaced families. Gaza's government media office says 72 Palestinians were killed in the strike, although that number wasn't confirmed. The health ministry said that nearly 30% of the victims of the massacre were children. So Bet Lahia is one of the cities in northern Gaza where Israeli forces have been conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign, forcing Palestinian civilians to flee under threat of death. And 3 cities in northern Gaza have been under complete siege since early October. Israeli strikes on Sunday also hit the Burji and Nusra refugee camps in central Gaza. Middle East Eye said that at least 10 people were killed in the attacks. According to Wafa, 4 Palestinians were killed in Nusra. Gaza's health ministry said in its daily death toll updates, which are released about midday Gaza time, that at least 47 Palestinians were killed and 139 were wounded in the previous 12-hour period, but those only includes the dead who are brought to hospitals or morgues, which many are not, particularly in northern Gaza, where it seems anywhere the Palestinians go outside, they are shot at by the Israeli forces. So the ministry said there are a number of victims under the rubble and on the streets, and ambulance and civilian defense crews cannot reach them. The official numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry are 43,846 dead since October 7, 2023, and the number of wounded is 103,740. So a number of American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza estimate in an open letter that they sent to President Biden in October that the Israeli bombing and siege have killed at least 118,000 Palestinians. And of course, that number is certainly much higher now than it was at the time that they put it out. The U.S. continues to support the genocidal slaughter by providing military aid to Israel. Last week, a UN panel said Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, and Human Rights Watch said Israel was carrying out ethnic cleansing, but the U.S. denied both charges to ensure weapon shipments continue to flow. So this was a pretty important story. So Israeli settler activist Daniela Weiss has claimed that she has scouted a location in northern Gaza where she wants to establish Jewish settlements, Haaretz reported on Sunday. In an appearance on Israel's Channel 13 on Saturday night, Weiss said that she had 740 families who are ready to move into Gaza, and she hoped that she would get support from 1 million to 2 million people. Yesterday, we were on a tour, a temporary site near the Gaza border, where we set up 40 trailers that will eventually move into Gaza, Weiss said. When asked if she entered Gaza, she said, "The truth is we are still a few steps away from real estate, but yes, I was in the field." In response to Weiss's comments, an Israeli military spokesman said if this indeed occurred, it was a violation of laws and regulation. Weiss hinted that she entered the Nazarene Corridor, a strip of land that was the site of a Jewish settlement until 2005 and is currently controlled by the Israeli military. The IDF has destroyed just about every building in the corridor, which separates northern Gaza from the rest of the strip. The Israeli military is also conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza that involves demolishing houses so Palestinians can have nowhere to return to, which is expected to pave the way for Jewish settlements. And so you see how this is all playing out right now. As the ethnic cleansing is actually ongoing, you already have one lady going there and trying to stake out her claims of what former Palestinian land will now be hers once the previous occupants are all dead. So the Israeli military, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has claimed that he's opposed to settling Gaza, but the idea is openly supported by many Israeli members of the Knesset and members of his own Likud party. When asked about Netanyahu's stated objection, Weiss said, "If it's unrealistic, we'll make it realistic. What did we do in the settlements of Judea and Samaria? We turned the unrealistic into the realistic. We will do the same thing here." So at the Resettle Gaza conference last month, Weiss said Jewish settlements would start popping up in Gaza within the year, and it does seem that Israel is certainly on the pace to do that. All right, so this is a follow-up from something we covered last week. Again, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, November 17th. Iran denies that its UN ambassador met with Elon Musk. So on Saturday, the Iranian foreign minister denied a report published by the New York Times that said Iran's ambassador to the United Nations had met with Elon Musk about the upcoming Trump administration. So this is the statement. This reported meeting was fabricated story by American media, and the motives behind it can also be speculated. In my opinion, the American media's fabrication about a meeting between Elon Musk and Iran's representative is a form of testing the waters to see if such a ground for the move exists. The foreign minister said Iran is looking for the incoming administration to clarify its policies, and based on that, we will adjust our own policies. He added that the supreme leader hadn't given permission for such a meeting. The Times report, which cited unnamed Iranian officials, said that the meeting was about how to diffuse tensions between the U.S. and Iran. The Iranian sources described the meeting as positive and good news. However, based on President Donald Trump's campaign pits, all signs are indicating that the incoming administration will take a harder line on Iran. Senator Marco Rubio, who is nominated for Secretary of State, and Rep. Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, have called for the return to maximum pressure, a reference to the first Trump administration's Iran policy, which involved tearing up the 2015 nuclear deal and imposing crippling sanctions on Iran, as well as assassinating Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. President Biden essentially continued the maximum pressure campaign, but Iran was able to export to oil markets in Asia, where buyers aren't afraid of U.S. sanctions. And so, we were talking about this. This has a lot to do with the Russia policy, where the Trump administration is coming in with this idea that, the Biden administration is just being weak on sanctions, and if they really enforce the sanctions, then they would be able to, cripple Tehran and Moscow, and I'm sure Beijing too. But if you look at what happened under the Biden administration, is American sanctions became far less effective because we had simply sanctioned too much of the world. And for much of the global economy, it became beneficial to risk violating U.S. sanctions and then being able to trade with Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, China, rather than being cut off from all those markets if you choose to comply with American sanctions. And so I think this idea that they can come back into office and just enforce the economic wars more effectively and produce some kind of results are just fanciful and unrealistic given what's happened over the past 4 years. All right, last story up here today. U.S., Japan, Australia agreed to increase trilateral exercises. So the U.S., Japan, and Australia agreed on Sunday to increase trilateral military cooperation as Washington is working to boost alliances in the region as part of its plan to prepare for a future war with China. Defense ministers from the three countries, including Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, met in Darwin, Australia, which is home to a military base that's being expanded to house U.S. B-52 long-range bombers. The defense ministers announced the three militaries will begin conducting trilateral amphibious military drills in 2025 during Australia's Talisman Sabre, which has gotten much bigger in recent years. Australia will also send troops to participate in Orient Shield, an annual training exercise that takes place in Japan and involves the U.S. and Japanese troops. Last year, a new U.S.-backed military pact between Australia and Japan that makes it easier for the two countries to deploy troops to each other's territory came into effect, and they've been talking about expanding the AUKUS Accords to include Japan as well, so that's something that we could see as a part of this. The U.S., Japan, and Australia also announced their goal is to construct a trilateral live-fire exercise during Talisman Sabre by 2023. The minister said the integral trilateral regional air and missile defense live-fire events at Exercise Talisman Sabre 2027 will be a key milestone. The U.S. is openly preparing for a future direct conflict with China, despite the risk of nuclear war, and the alliance's building is key to those plans. Earlier this year, the US, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines conducted military drills together in the South China Sea for the first time. And we see they're just continuing to build these paths. We have the Quad that includes India. We now have this trilateral path with South Korea and Japan. And so you see we're just building this massive blot surrounding China for a future war with China. An insanely aggressive and reckless policy. All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more later in the week.